My mother-in-law looked at me across her granite kitchen island, 60 people standing in her backyard for the company anniversary party, and said into the microphone, "And of course, the future of Pemberton Dental Group belongs to family. That's why I'm thrilled to announce my grandson Tobias as our new director of clinical operations." I was holding a plastic cup of lemonade. I remember that detail more than anything else. The ice had mostly melted. There was a slice of lemon floating in it that our caterer had cut too thick, and I watched it bob there while everybody around me started clapping, and I just stood very still and felt the whole shape of the last 19 years rearrange itself in about 4 seconds. My name is Desmond Faraday. I'm 54 years old, and for 19 years I ran Pemberton Dental Group out of Asheville, North Carolina. Not the dentistry part. I'm not a dentist. I ran everything else, which in a multi-location practice is roughly 90% of why the lights stay on and the money keeps coming in. Let me back up, because the lemonade isn't really where this starts. I met Renata Pemberton when I was 33 at a continuing education conference in Charlotte where I was speaking on practice management, and she was sitting in the third row taking notes faster than anybody else in the room. She wasn't a dentist either. She was the daughter of one, the daughter of Marguerite Pemberton, who had a single practice on Marymount Avenue and a reputation for being the most feared and respected woman in the County Dental Society. Renata and I got married 18 months after that conference. Her mother came to the wedding in a dove-gray suit and shook my hand like she was assessing whether I'd hold up under load. Marguerite offered me a job about 6 months into the marriage. 1 office, 4 operatories, a front desk run by a woman named Delphine, who'd been there since the Carter administration and treated the appointment book like a sacred text. The practice was doing fine. Fine the way a lot of small medical practices do fine, which is to say it was leaking money in 9 different directions and nobody had the time or the stomach to look at where. I had the time. I'd spent my 20s in hospital administration and then 4 years consulting for a dental service organization down in Atlanta, which is a fancy way of saying I'd seen the inside of a few hundred practices and I knew exactly where the bodies were buried. Marguerite's office was buried in them. Insurance write-offs that should never have been written off. Hygiene recall rates sitting at maybe 40% when they should have been north of 70%. A billing system held together by Delphine's memory and a binder full of sticky notes. So I fixed it, 1 thing at a time, 1 year at a time. The first year I rebuilt the insurance verification process and recovered almost $200,000 in claims that had simply been left on the table. The second year I built out a recall system from scratch, taught myself the practice management software on weekends at my own kitchen table. Got our hygiene retention up past 75%. Third year we opened a second location out in Hendersonville. By year 8 we had 4 offices and 22 operatories. By year 15, we had 7 locations across the western part of the state, a regional reputation, contracts with 2 of the big self-insured employer plans in the area, and revenue that had gone from a little under $1 million a year to just over $14 million. Marguerite gave me a title around year 10. Chief Operating Officer. Sounded important. There was no equity attached to it. No ownership agreement, no buy-in path. Nothing on paper that said any part of what I was building was actually mine. Just a title and a salary of $130,000 that hadn't moved in 5 years even as the thing I was running tripled and then quadrupled. I told myself it didn't matter. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part I'm least proud of. I told myself the work was the reward. I told myself Marguerite would do right by me eventually, that the structure would catch up to the contribution, that families take care of the people who take care of them. I believed that for a long time. Renata believed it too, or wanted to, which isn't quite the same thing. Here's what I didn't fully understand until much later. When you marry into a family business, you are never inside it. You're the help with the wedding ring. You're the one who keeps the trains running so the actual family can stand up at the holiday dinner and talk about what we've built. I was at every one of those dinners. Marguerite would raise a glass to the legacy, and her 2 daughters and her grandkids would nod, and I'd be sitting at the end of the table where the leaf folded out. The guy who'd actually built the thing she was toasting, smiling along like I was part of it. Then her grandson graduated. Tobias was Renata's nephew, my wife's sister's boy, 28 years old with a freshly minted MBA from a school whose name Marguerite liked to say slowly, with a little pause before it, like she was savoring something. He had exactly 0 days of experience in healthcare administration. What he had was the last name on the building and a vocabulary full of words like scalability, and operational synergy, and leveraging our footprint, which you deployed in meetings with the confidence of a man who had never once been responsible for making payroll. He came on as a special projects coordinator the summer he graduated. I trained him. Of course I trained him. That's what you do. You show up, you do the work, you don't make it personal, and you assume the people above you are being reasonable. For 14 months I walked Tobias through everything, how insurance reimbursement actually works versus how the textbooks say it works, why you never let a hygiene schedule run more than 2 weeks out, how to read a production report and tell in 30 seconds whether a location was healthy or quietly drowning, how to talk to a dentist who's convinced he's losing money when the real problem is he's giving away 40 minutes of unbilled chair time a day. He took notes. He nodded a lot. He once told a room full of office managers that we needed to think disruptively about the patient journey, and I watched a 40-year veteran of the front desk physically bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. But I was patient. I figured Marguerite was bringing him along slow, building him up, and that there'd be a real conversation at some point about what the future of the whole thing looked like, about succession, about where a guy who'd given 19 years fit into the plan. There was a conversation, just not the one I was expecting, and not in a room. It was in a backyard, over a microphone with a melting cup of lemonade in my hand. After she said it, after the clapping, Tobias came over and shook my hand. He had this look on his face, this earnest, slightly nervous look, and he said, "I'm really looking forward to learning from you, Des. I know there's a lot I don't know yet." And I said something gracious, I don't even remember what, and I shook his hand, and Renata appeared at my elbow with her jaw set in a way I'd only seen a handful of times in 20 years. We didn't talk about it in the car. There were too many people watching us leave. But when we got home, she put her keys down on the counter and stood there with her back to me for a second, and then she turned around and said, "She didn't tell me. Des, I swear to God she did not tell me she was going to do that." I believed her. That mattered then and later. Whatever else I'm about to tell you, understand that my wife was on my side from the first second, and that's more than a lot of men in my position get. I told her I needed a few days to think. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already started thinking, somewhere on the second sip of that lemonade. I took the next 3 days and worked from home, which I was entitled to do and which I did, just not on Pemberton work. I sat at my kitchen table with 19 years of files, and I went through all of it, slowly, the way you go through a house before you sell it, deciding what's load-bearing and what just looks like it is. Here's what I found on the second day. I'd capped a binder. Not a company binder, my binder, a fat 3-ring thing I'd started my first month on the job, back when I thought I'd be there 3 years and move on. And it was every contract I'd ever negotiated. And when I read them again, slowly, with different eyes than the eyes I'd had when I signed them, I started to see the shape of something. The 2 big employer health plans. The ones that sent us a combined $6 million a year in patient volume, the ones that were the actual engine of the whole operation, had been negotiated by me. Personally. My name was on them as the contracting administrator of record, and in both of those agreements there was language I had written myself years ago requiring that the designated network administrator remain consistent as a condition of the in-network rate structure. I'd put that clause in to protect the practice from getting jerked around if one of the plans tried to renegotiate mid-term. I wasn't thinking about myself at all when I wrote it. I was protecting the company. Turns out, I was protecting something else. Those plans didn't have a relationship with Pemberton Dental Group. Not really. They had a relationship with me. The benefits coordinators on the other end of those contracts had my cell phone number. They called me directly when there was a credentialing issue or a fee schedule question. They'd been doing it for years. To them, Pemberton was a name on a letterhead. The actual person who solved their problems, who picked up on a Saturday, who knew the difference between a clean claim and a clean-looking claim, was me. Then I looked at the software. Years 3 through 6. I'd built a patient recall and revenue cycle dashboard from scratch because the off-the-shelf stuff was garbage and Marguerite wouldn't pay for the good version. I built it on my own laptop, on my own time, on weekends, layering it on top of the practice software through an interface I wrote myself. Every location ran on it. It was the reason our recall rates were double the industry average. It was the reason our collections were so clean, and it had never, not once, been formally transferred to the company. There was no intellectual property clause in my original employment agreement. Marguerite's attorney back then was a general practice guy who mostly did wills and the occasional fence line dispute. Nobody had ever thought to ask me to assign anything. Why would they? I was family. Sort of. I closed the laptop and sat there with my coffee going cold, and I want to be accurate about this, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Tired and very, very clear. 19 years of treating their problems like mine because I genuinely stopped being able to tell the difference. 19 years of acting in good faith and never once asking for protection in return, because it never occurred to me I'd need it. That's not stupidity, that's trust. And trust, I was learning at 54, is worth exactly what the other person decides it's worth. There was a man named Halverson Rowe. He ran a group called Blue Ridge Dental Partners out of Greenville, just across the South Carolina line. We crossed paths at conferences for years, sat next to each other at a state association lunch once, and ended up talking for 2 hours about value-based reimbursement while everybody else drifted off to the bar. He was the kind of guy who asked real questions and actually listened to the answers. He'd reached out to me twice over the past 3 years, not aggressive, just a standing thing. His last message, maybe 8 months back, Des, the door's open here whenever you want it. We pay for experience and we put names on the work. I'd ignored it both times, out of loyalty, out of habit, out of the belief that the people you build something for will eventually recognize what you built. On the third day, I called him. I was starting to think you'd never pick up the phone, he said, and he sounded genuinely glad, not smug about it. We met 2 days later at a barbecue place halfway between Asheville and Greenville, a spot off the highway with paper towels on the table and a brisket that had no business being that good. No white tablecloths. No power dynamics built into the furniture. Halverson was in his late 50s, built like a man who'd done physical work before he ever did a spreadsheet. He asked smart questions about employer plan contracting, about multi-site credentialing, about how I'd gotten our collection rates where they were. He didn't need me to explain the basics. That alone told me something. The offer was $195,000 base, with a performance bonus tied to the metrics I'd actually control, and the title of Vice President of Operations over 5 locations they were planning to expand to 8. And then he said something I had not heard one single time in 19 years at Pemberton. Your name goes on every contract you build. And if you've developed systems on your own time, on your own equipment, we've got a process for that. Real valuation, real paperwork. You get credited and you get paid. I drove home that night thinking about the dashboard sitting on my personal laptop and about a clause I'd written a decade ago to protect a company that had just announced my replacement over a microphone at a garden party. Renata was up when I got in. We sat at the kitchen table a long time. And she said the thing I'll remember for the rest of my life. She said, "My grandmother built a practice. You built the company she has now. Those are 2 different things, Des. They were always 2 different things, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud." I told her I was calling Halverson back in the morning. She nodded and said, "Good." I called him the next day. Told him I was in. We set a start date 3 weeks out. Then I did the thing that I know some of you are going to have feelings about, so let me walk you through it carefully, because every single step of it was clean, and clean mattered to me more than fast. I talked up my resignation letter. 2 weeks' notice. Professional. No editorializing, no jabs, no 19 years of grievance squeezed into a paragraph. Plain paper, not company letterhead. That felt right. But before I submitted it, I sat down and I wrote 2 emails. One to each of the benefits coordinators at the 2 big employer health plans. People I'd worked with for years, people whose kids' names I knew, people who'd called me directly because I was the one who actually solved things. The emails were formal and short. I informed each of them that I would be transitioning out of my role at Pemberton Dental Group, that my last day would be in 2 weeks, and that going forward I could be reached through Blue Ridge Dental Partners in Greenville. I noted that I'd be personally overseeing network operations in my new capacity. I included Halverson's contact information. I didn't say one bad word about Pemberton. I didn't editorialize. I notified the relevant parties of a change in the designated network administrator, which, in both of those contracts, was not just my right. It was my obligation under the continuity clause I'd written myself. I sent them, and then I walked the resignation letter down the hall to Marguerite's office. She was at her desk doing the crossword in pen, which she did every morning like a person establishing dominance over the day. She read the letter in about 10 seconds. Then she set it down and looked at me over her reading glasses. 2 weeks, she said. Not a question. 2 weeks, I said. She asked where I was going. I told her Blue Ridge. Her face did something I'd never seen it do. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like the face of someone who just realized they'd left the gate open and the dog was already 3 streets over. She asked if maybe we could talk about a different arrangement. Some kind of shared structure with Tobias. A consulting role, even. I told her about the Blue Ridge offer. She said they were overpaying. I told her that was between me and them. She said she hoped this wouldn't make things hard with Renata. I told her Renata and I had talked it all the way through and we were just fine. Then she said, I built this practice from nothing, Desmond. I looked at her for a second. You built one office and a binder full of sticky notes, Marguerite. I built the rest. We both know that. I walked out before she could answer. The next 2 weeks were strange in the way endings always are when nobody wants to admit something's ending. People who'd barely nodded at me for years suddenly wanted to grab lunch. Delphine, who by now was somewhere north of 70 and had been there longer than the building's current roof, stopped by my office, put her hand on the doorframe and said, Well, they've gone and stepped in it, haven't they? That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Tobias started following me around with a tablet. He had questions about everything, the employer plan renewal cycles, the fee schedules, how we handled credentialing for new associate dentists, why we routed certain referrals the way we did. I answered every single question patiently, completely. If I was going to leave, I was going to leave clean. I gave him everything that was in the public contract files. Names, emails, office numbers, the whole thing. There were exactly 2 things I did not hand over. The first was the dashboard. Nobody asked me about it directly, which told me Tobias didn't understand it existed as a separate thing. To him, the practice just collected money efficiently and patients just came back on schedule. He had no idea there was a specific system underneath all of it, built on a personal laptop, updated on my own time for 16 years. I wasn't going to volunteer it. That wasn't deception. It was simply not giving away something that had never been theirs to begin with. The second was the relationships. On my last Thursday, Tobias asked if I'd set up a call with the employer plan coordinators so he could introduce himself before I left. I told him I'd send him their contact information, which I did. What I didn't tell him was that those coordinators had already heard from me 2 weeks earlier, that they already had Blue Ridge's information sitting in their files, that when Tobias called those numbers and introduced himself as the new director of clinical operations, he'd be talking to people who already knew exactly where I'd gone, and who were already quietly wondering whether they needed to rethink their renewal conversations. I wasn't burning Pemberton down. I was just done carrying their water. I cleaned out my office on that last Friday. The binder went into my bag first, then a photograph from 2 Thanksgivings. Back, Renata, me, and our daughter Cordelia on the back porch, the kid grinning in a Clemson sweatshirt she'd worn nearly every day since the acceptance letter came. Cordelia was a sophomore now, on the engineering track. The tuition help Marguerite had floated at a family dinner years ago, never written down, never formalized, had quietly evaporated the same way a lot of Marguerite's promises did, gradually and without acknowledgement. We were paying for it ourselves. It was tight. We were managing. I took one last look around the office that had never technically been mine. No real door, no nameplate, just a desk in a converted supply room because, as I'd been told, we like to keep things flexible. Out the window, I could see the parking lot of the flagship location, full of patients' cars. Every appointment behind every one of them scheduled by a system I built. I walked out at 5:15 on a Friday, and I didn't look back. Monday morning, Tobias started making phone calls. My first month at Blue Ridge felt like walking into a room where the air pressure was different. Nobody called me anybody's son-in-law. Nobody copied Marguerite on emails to keep her in the loop. When I said something in a meeting, people wrote it down and then actually did it. I had a real office. Door, nameplate, a window facing the courtyard. Small things. But after 19 years at a desk in a supply room, I noticed every one of them. I did what I always did when I came into an operation. I listened before I talked. I sat with the front desk teams, rode along on a couple of location visits, learned how Blue Ridge's numbers actually behaved versus how they looked on a report. I found 4 leaks in the first 2 weeks that nobody had flagged because nobody had been looking at the right data. Halverson didn't hover. He checked in once a day, asked one good question, and left me alone to work. That was new too. In the second month, Blue Ridge formally acquired the dashboard through the process Halverson had described at that barbecue place. Documented. Fair market valuation. My name on the assignment. It wasn't a fortune. That was never the point. The point was that for the first time in 19 years, something I'd built was officially, legally, unambiguously mine. And then mine to sell, on my terms, to someone who understood what it was worth. Within 2 quarters, collections across Blue Ridge's locations climbed 11%. Recall rates jumped. The numbers got good enough that Halverson put them into a proposal he was building to bid on one of the big regional self-insured employer plans, a plan that, as it happened, Pemberton Dental Group had held for years. Both groups went after it, and I knew Pemberton's numbers better than Tobias ever would. I knew their cost structure, their margins, where they were soft. I didn't use any of that improperly. I didn't have to. I just built a proposal around capabilities that were genuinely stronger now, running on better systems with better data. The plan moved its network to Blue Ridge. $6 million in annual patient volume, walking out the same door I'd walked out of. The week after the decision came down, my phone rang. A 828 area code I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It was Tobias. The message ran almost 4 minutes. The assured version, Pemberton, was struggling with 2 plan renewals. Some of the coordinators weren't responding to him, and he was wondering if I'd be willing to consult informally. Just a couple of calls, off the books, to smooth things over. He said Marguerite didn't know he was calling. He said he'd really appreciate it. I listened to it twice, then I called him back. I told him I'd be glad to help in a formal consulting capacity. My current rate for external practice operations consulting was $350 an hour, billed in 2-hour minimums with a 3-session retainer required up front. I told him I could have an engagement letter drawn up by the end of the week if he wanted to move forward. He said he'd have to think about it. He never called back. Marguerite called 5 times over the following month. I let everyone go to voicemail. Each message was a variation on the same theme, consulting opportunities, bringing my expertise back in some new capacity. Generous compensation, what's happened to this family? The 5th message had an edge, the first 4 didn't. She used the word loyalty twice. I sat with that word for a full day. Loyalty. 19 years of 6 a.m. starts and Saturday vendor calls and credentialing audits that ran till 9 at night. 19 years of treating their problems like my own because I'd stopped being able to tell them apart. If that wasn't loyalty, I don't know what the word means. And if it was, then Marguerite had gotten 19 years of it for free. I called her back on a Sunday morning. She picked up on the second ring and started talking before I could say anything. The practice, the restructuring, the conversations she'd been having, how much had changed. I waited until she ran out. Then I said, "You told me blood runs that practice. You were right about that." I just went back to mine. I hung up. A few months later I found out, through Renata, that Pemberton had sold a controlling interest in 3 of its 7 locations to a dental service organization to stabilize their cash position after the plan losses. Marguerite stepped back from the day-to-day not long after. Tobias stayed on in a reduced role, reporting to somebody the DSO sent in from out of state. I don't know the details and I don't need them. What I know is that at the Regional Dental Association meeting that fall, Blue Ridge was recognized for the operational turnaround, and Halverson got up and introduced me as the person who'd architected it. First time in 19 years my name had been attached, out loud, in public, to work I'd actually done. Renata drove down for the evening. She stood next to me at the reception in a blue dress I hadn't seen in years, and she looked like someone who'd made a decision and was at peace with it. On the drive home, she told me Cordelia had made the dean's list. I'd like to take credit for that, but the kid's always been sharper than me. We paid for that year ourselves. It was tighter than it should have been, but every dollar of it was clean. Here's what I keep coming back to, 2 years on. I spent 19 years building something inside a structure that was never going to give me credit for it. Not because the work wasn't good. They knew the work was good, but because the structure was never designed to see me. I was the son-in-law, the helpful one, the operational backbone that let other people stand at the front of the room and raise a glass to a legacy. I'm not bitter about it. Being bitter would mean I regret the work, and I don't. The work was real, the systems held, the collections came in clean. So if you spend years running somebody else's operation, a family business, a company with your fingerprints on everything and your name on nothing, you already know what I'm talking about. You felt it. That slow, cold realization that loyalty only runs one direction in certain rooms. Know what you actually own, not what you've contributed to, not what you've been allowed to use. What is legally, documentably, provably yours. Your relationships, your systems, your name in the right clause of the right contract. Write it down. Date it. Understand the difference between their property and your leverage. And when the day comes, and it comes for more of us than anybody wants to admit, don't leave angry. Leave prepared. 19 years went by before I understood a simple thing. Nothing in that backyard happened by accident. Marguerite handed my job to Tobias because I'd taught her every single day for 2 decades that she could take from me without consequence. That's the part nobody likes to hear. The people who walked all over me did it because I laid down and called it loyalty. Cause and effect. I built a structure that rewarded my silence, and then I was shocked when the silence got me nothing. But the same law that buried me is the one that got me out. The clause I wrote into those insurance contracts a decade earlier didn't appear out of nowhere. The dashboard sitting on my own laptop didn't build itself. Every quiet, careful decision I made over the years, the documenting, the dating, the keeping of my own binder, that was a seed planted long before I knew I'd need the harvest. When Marguerite stood up at that microphone, I wasn't lucky. I was prepared. And preparation is just yesterday's discipline showing up to collect. Here's what I'd want my daughter Cordelia to take from all this, because I've thought about how to say it to her. The first thing is that you never let bitterness make your decisions for you. I had every reason to torch that practice on my way out, and I didn't. Because the moment you do something dishonest, you hand the other person the right to call you the villain. I left clean. I told the truth. I did only what was mine to do. That clean exit is the reason I could look anyone in the eye afterward, and is the reason the people who mattered came to my side. The second thing is to keep your eyes open even when you're comfortable. For 19 years, I confused being needed with being valued, and those are not the same thing. The day I sat down at my kitchen table and actually read my own contracts with clear eyes, that's the day everything turned. Not because I got angry, because I finally got smart about what I owned versus what I'd merely been allowed to touch. And the third thing is the hardest. When the floor drops out, you don't get to fall apart. You get 3 days, maybe, to feel it. And then you stand up and you do the slow, unglamorous work of building your way out. Calling Halverson took something. Walking that letter into Marguerite's office took something. Saying my piece on a Sunday morning and then hanging up took something. Marguerite told me blood runs that practice. She was right. I just stopped bleeding for people who'd never bleed for me, and I went home to the family that actually showed up. If you're sitting where I sat, hear me. Be honest enough that no one can shame you. Be sharp enough to know what's truly yours, and be steady enough to walk out the door when it's time. Don't leave angry. Leave prepared.